All right, well, thank you all for coming. My name is Peter Harrigan. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the philosophy department here studying medieval philosophy. We have three really awesome speakers today. The format of the next hour and a half will essentially be that each speaker will have 20 minutes to present their paper, and then we'll have 10 minutes of question and answer following that, and we'll just go speaker by speaker. So first up, we have Dr. Layne Hancock. He is the program coordinator and editor at the United States Air Force Academy's Institute for Future Conflict. He graduated with a PhD from the University of Notre Dame with a major in moral theology and a minor in early modern philosophy. Dr. Hancock's talk today is entitled Aquinas and the Augustinian Legacy of Election Voluntarism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hancock.
There we go. All right. Welcome. Please excuse my informal dress. My blazer is somewhere in a rental car in Denver. But thank you for coming this morning. I have a presentation that is basically just two tables. The one I want lots of feedback from Thomists here, so here's the plan. Basically an introduction to the voluntarism literature, what it is and what sort of work it does. The second is the Peter Lombard table. The third is the Thomas Aquinas table. That's where you guys come in. And then we'll do Q&A. So, voluntarism is and it's sort of nearby, its intellectual neighbors like nominalism is an important feature for histories of philosophy and histories of theology. So over here in the early 1980s, we had Francis Oakley and William Courtenay, and this book just came out, 2023, Stephen Darwell. But basically, the history of voluntarism gives a tale that once upon a time, Thomas Aquinas, as Aristotle is transmitted to the West, Thomas Aquinas comes along and synthesizes all the problems of Aristotle and Christian theology together. But alas, once we get to past Aquinas and maybe the condemnations of 1277 and so on and so forth, Scotus and the people that follow afterwards and Occam really, muck it up. They really fumble the football. Next thing you know, you get Occam, nominalism, Luther, Reformation, secularism, and Walmart, right? So that's generally how the narrative goes. There's a traditional there's a version of this that is sympathetic to traditional Catholicism. I don't really know which screen to go to, but basically, like traditional Roman Catholics really like this tale. But there's also a sense in which secular moral philosophers and historians actually go for it. They just like different versions of the tale. So this conversation is about sort of reevaluating. I'm not saying that there's nothing to those histories. I think they're actually quite interesting. I think the debates in the early medieval and early modern period are very fascinating. So here's the most recent book in which voluntarism, voluntas, coming from the Latin will, requires two commitments according to these editors. It requires the idea that the will is a self-determining power and a strong modal conception of contingency. And so this is a compilation of three major sections of voluntarism: psychological voluntarism, ethical voluntarism, theological voluntarism. I don't think these are entirely off the beaten path, but I have two faults with it. The first is that these categories have been slowly evolving and attempting to map the territory and the terrain since about the 1980s, and I don't think we're even quite there yet. The second problem is that Muller and Schierbaum's development story, where they try to do what I just did, namely say, here's Scotus, he's got the psychological account of the will, and the will has to be such and such way with respect to the good and to God, and this eventually develops from 1 to 2 to 3, actually just doesn't work. Like, it doesn't fit the primary source materials, and it certainly doesn't fit the early modern era. So, in place of this, I'm recommending a move to sort of an inductive method in which the categories come straight from the church's longest standing textbook, namely Peter Lombard. So he kind of needs an introduction, despite the fact that he was the church's textbook for over a millennia. It's a compilation of patristics and tentea, or judgments, opinions presenting contradictory views. Augustine by far is the most important, and so in this talk, it's sort of, if I titled it Aquinas's Augustinian election voluntarism via Lombard, there'd be even less people here than there is today. But basically, Lombard is the control by which I get Augustine in, and so he's replete through it, and apart from the Bible, there is no other Christian text that gets so much commentary. So Aquinas all the way to Occam, Beale, and Luther. So you can, in the same way you can get Luther talking about a particular text and commenting on it and making commitments on it, you can do the same thing for Occam, Aquinas on Lombard. And when we go to Lombard, we find three different kinds of debate on the will. So over here is the sentence, the book, the distinction, and where it is located. And the idea here is if I'm right about these categorizations and these debates, then this will help set up at least a 500-year account of voluntarism where we're not messing up the categories and applying names that sort of like anachronistically don't fit. So in the first kind is a kind of discussion about the faculty psychology of God, human creatures, and angels. The second kind is God's relationship to the moral truths, the 10 Commandments. Now, and the third kind is God's relationship to the saved and the damned. These are not the same. These are obviously have things to do, particularly with God's will, but these are not identical things. What you have to say about one, when you're commenting on Lombard, does not entail a one-to-one, it's not logical entailment from here to here to here. So one can be committed to a more voluntarist account on the first section, but not on the third. So I'm calling these agential voluntarism, theological voluntarism, and then election voluntarism. There are two more that come in the early modern period thanks to Descartes and Jonathan Edwards. We're not going to talk about those today, but this is just the same issue. God's relationship to mathematical truths comes up for referendum, and then God's relationship to created identity over time. That one is just, again, mathematical and identity voluntarism. So these are the three new ones located in the original primary source text. So when we go into election voluntarism, we look at those sections from Peter Lombard, you basically have, and this will be admittedly one of the most controversial points, positions that I take, namely that election voluntarism, there's two ways of cashing out election. You can either explain it where the reason God's choice for an individual lies in the creature, and by that I mean just reason giving, the explanation, the final explanation for why God picks somebody but does not pick the other lies in the creature, or it lies in the mere will or good pleasure, eudokia, of God. All right? So in Lombard, particularly Book 1, Distinctions 40 through 41, he doesn't include Pelagius and Origen, although there's a very fascinating backstory about how, basically Pelagius is an Origenist. But what he does include is Augustine's early position, which has the commitment that God's election of a particular person is on the basis of foreknown faith, which is nearly identical to Pelagius's position. But then Lombard also includes the late Augustinian position. So Lombard codifies a priority, and it's very clear. You can't. Lombard is not sort of a very neutral historian. He's very derogatory and very clear that you, dear reader, should prefer the later Augustinian account of election, where the grounding is based on the sheer good pleasure and will of God. And if you try to give explanations up and above that, it's no bueno. So Aquinas is reading this. He does it, I forget exactly what year he does the commentary on Lombard, but he reads Predestination of the Saints and the Gift of Perseverance, Augustine's most late anti-Pelagian writings late in his career, possibly when he's in the papal library. All this sort of stuff is, I'm not hanging any part of my argument or presentation of Aquinas as an election voluntarist on this. I'm instead doing that on the basis of this. So this is his Romans commentary. So regardless of whether the Romans commentary comes before or after the prima pars of the Summa, questions 19 through 24, what's interesting is that in these just 4 or 5 paragraphs in the Romans commentary is nearly every single set contra from the question on predestination. Every single authority, almost every single authority, almost every single debate goes one-to-one with Aquinas commenting on Romans 9 through, verses 6 through 13. So there's a high conceptual overlap between the Summa on this topic and Aquinas is thinking in Romans 9. So, I already mentioned that he's got Lombard in front of him, or at least in the back of his mind, if he doesn't have it right in front of him. He's working on the Summa nearby, and he's finishing the commentary on the Romans. So, I couldn't include titles because there was literally so much text. My apologies to my teachers. They raised me better than this, but this is sort of the best I can do. On this left column, it are Aquinas. So here's the big reveal. This is the table that I care about and want feedback on. This is Romans 9 and the verses. So the sections. These are the paragraph sections in Aquinas' commentary, and then this is where Aquinas will later flesh all these commitments out. So what follows are the 14 propositions that Aquinas is committed to, and that I take to characterize his election voluntarism. So first, God elects a nation, namely Israel, and individuals. And if you're Peter Arioli or N.T. Wright, this is where you hop off. You immediately say it's not about individuals, you say it's just about corporate bodies, but that idea doesn't come until really, really, really late in the scholastic tradition. Second, human sinfulness incurs an infinite demerit. Thank you, Anselm. 3, God's decrees are certain and eternally fixed. That's just a commitment of the Boethian eternal timelessness of God. 4, God elects and reprobates humans towards their final end. It says in the first part, question 23, article 23, sed contra, God does reprobate some men. 5, this is the nodal point. How do I figure out whether or not somebody is a voluntarist or they're an intellectualist on the topic of election? Aquinas makes it very clear in article 5 that God's election is not grounded on anything foreknown in the creature. 6, God's will towards humanity is twofold. This gets at the antecedent consequent will distinction. 7, God is not the author of sin, despite all this. And again, these are basically in chronological order. Where I got these 14 propositions are just from Aquinas' exegesis. 8, predestination and free will are God's means towards accomplishing these final ends. What I am not saying in 8, 6, and 4, that these are exactly identical, and there's no difference whatsoever, because Aquinas is going to come back in and say, sin as a cause is not the same as infused virtue or infused charity. Sin operates differently and is permissively allowed and works differently than the way God works than those who are elect. God's will, and this is an important commitment that will come under heavy scrutiny in the early modern period. God's will somehow retains contingency and does not impose absolute necessity. Election is not fatalistic because God wills both the ends and the means. You can't just sit back. Aquinas has rebuttal to certain opponents who escape me right now, but basically the thought is, okay, if all this is true, but we just go to number 3, it doesn't look like I should get up in the morning, go to mass, or practice virtue because God already knows what is going to be at stake. Aquinas has arguments against that. I think I'm going to get the citation wrong, but in question 23 on predestination, he asked the question whether one ought to pray for others given the fact that God knows from the book of life, question 24, who is in and who is out. 12, God fittingly displays 3 divine attributes, namely divine glory, divine justice, and divine mercy. This is verses 21 through 23. That gets at the motive of the divine will. 13, this sort of display of the divine attributes requires the vision across the chasm. And then, if you don't know what that means, let's not talk about it. Proposition 14, and I had to go outside of Romans 9 for this one, but basically God does all this for a greater mysterious good. So, if we could pause really quickly, I meant to, before I went through, to have you guys flag which ones you thought were false. If you could just, if anyone, any Thomists in the room would like to throw up a number that they think is like, I think number 5 is, BS, I don't think it's true. That would be great.
As described by St. Thomas.
Yeah, as described by Thomas. Any formulation, we can quibble about the formulation if you like, but basically any Any objections thus far to these 14 propositions?
14 to 16, you'll have to specify based on his distinctions in prima secunda, prima pars 19, the various senses of will.
Yes.
All right. Is that
Yep. Any other quibbles? We'll save the rest of it for like Q&A, but I want to get on the table any objections or concerns, comments thus far. Okay, so here are the people that agree with those 14 propositions. Obviously, the late Augustine, but also, and notice I put others who agree with exegetical election voluntarism, i.e., when you go read Aquinas on Romans 9, and then you go read these guys, you will find functionally no difference. The late Martin Luther, Melanchthon, Calvin, and Jonathan Edwards. Exegetically, though, they can sign off on all 14 of those propositions from the basis of Scripture. So, that brings it into my presentation. Why do this? Why bother with this? Well, I'm a Jonathan Edwards scholar, and so pardon the insecurity, but basically, the objections for getting Jonathan Edwards back into the moral theology arena, and really just into the theology arena, are all based on election voluntarism objections. And so one of the things I had to do for my chapter, for my dissertation, was explain to those who were not familiar with the scholastic tradition that actually those 14 propositions are just the common Western Augustinian inheritance. So this isn't meant to be some sort of, I'm not ragging on Thomas. I think Thomas is doing the best he can. He's probably of the four or five people that I laid out, I think Thomas does do the best job reconciling faith and reason and Scripture and sort of our moral intuitions. But I would like for us to revise and re-narrate how we tell the history and the story of ethics, particularly if we go to like the Stephen Darwell account. The whole motive for telling this secular separation of ethics from theology rides on two moves in particular, namely the Reformation existing and all the reformers being committed to basically divine command. It's kind of a bastardized divine command theory where it's just God says it in Scripture, so that settles it. So there is no really thick moral reasoning, and that's supposed to coincide with this sort of voluntarism declension narrative. So you get secular ethics by running away from voluntaristic ethical accounts, and more importantly, I think what would be best that would come out of sharing those 14 propositions would be a common resolve for Protestants and Catholics to work together to resolve the tensions in sacred Scripture. So that's the presentation.
We have time for 10 minutes of questions. I can come around and pass down the microphone just by raising hands.
Could we go back to the table just to have?
Yeah. There we go. Yes.
Did you limit yourself in your choice of texts to the particular text that you do cite? Or
No.
are you also trying to pull from a broader range and include that in your chronology?
Yeah.
And do you have, you didn't really mention much of the Aquinas change later in life.
Yeah.
Thesis, how does that?
Are you referring to De Malo 6?
Yes, Montague.
Yes.
Yep.
So that part is important. I did read widely. I had a Dominican friend who was in my cohort who pressed me to make sure that I was reading widely and not just sort of cherry picking, proof texting. On the other, so that's first pass the answer. Second pass is one of the things. The reason why I wanted to, the same reason I liked Lombard is the same reason I liked going to Scripture, is because I want to see what Luther and Aquinas and Calvin have to say about this text in particular. Because I think very often if you listen to, I don't know, like Bishop Barron or the Thomistic Institute, presentations on these topics, they start with, sort of the most high-flying metaphysical distinctions in Aquinas, which are great and they're good, and then you go compare that to the legal training of Calvin. And what functionally is a difference of genre stands in as this like major chasm between Calvin, Luther, and Aquinas. So the goal of prioritizing the scriptural text was to work from the bottom and then talk about, like, I'll be very candid, be very honest right now, I think Aquinas' use of St. John Damascene, the antecedent consequent will, is a better distinction, like better bang for my buck than Calvin's like permissive and secret will distinction. So I do the best I can. This is, I didn't want to fit more text onto the table.
So thank you very much. I mean, I'm perhaps not a great friend of Luther and Calvin on some of the issues. And I wonder if this way of thinking about it might be a little confusing in that respect, because I do think there's a rather significant way in which, at least I think it's an active question for Thomistic scholarship, because I'm involved in debates on that, and I have very strong feelings about what Aquinas thinks about some of these things. But I would say, in particular, I think it's going to be something like propositions 6, 7, and 9 are going to be, and I think to a certain extent 4, are going to be rather different, I think, as far as I understand. I'm not an expert in Luther, Calvin, or Edwards, but I've been reading a lot of Calvin on the question of predestination, because I just wrote a book on hell. And the problem is, I think, the question of in what way is God not the author of sin? Mm-hmm. And I think this is very central, actually, in talking about both that. So a lot of people are very, Augustine is a compatibilist, and I'm not an Augustine scholar. But I think one of the striking things that you find in Luther and Calvin that you do not find, and you find the opposite in Augustine and Aquinas, it seems to me, is the idea that God predestines people to hell, or the idea that people don't have free will. They want to affirm all this necessity language and say, well, the necessity doesn't matter. They play up those claims from Augustine. But in fact, Augustine is very clear, it seems to me, that Adam did not sin necessarily. Satan did not sin necessarily. It wasn't anything God did in virtue of which Adam and Satan sinned.
Right.
And these other folks seem to say, of course it is. Now, I think with Calvin, that's a little bit more complicated, but I worry that they have a different framework for dealing with these claims about whether God is the author of sin or not. Where it seems to me that Augustine and Aquinas are very clear predestination is causative to grace and all that good stuff, but is not going to be causing the sin and all that kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas it seems to me Calvin means something quite different, and his explanation of how God is not the author of sin ends up on a totally different wavelength, trying to describe the way in which God is not the author of sin because he's, necessitating the acts of sin and those kind of things. And
So,
God will sin.
there's a lot there. Is there any one thing in particular you want me to take? Because I have 2 backup slides that we could talk about that relate to this.
Okay, well, my basic question is something about maybe the meaning of number 7 is equivocal across these.
Okay, I think that's probably true, and not necessarily equivocal, but it's sort of, these are propositions that have to be proved. You can't just take for granted, right? You can't just say God is not the author of sin, but also he infuses vice into you, which is not anything that the Protestants are saying. So I'll bring up what I called mutually assured destruction on the authorship of sin. All right, so here are comments from Occam and Beale, Robert Bellarmine, Cornelius Lampley, and Francisco Suarez. So these guys are all talking about, I think, the Secunda 79, where Aquinas is talking about the external cause of sin. And Aquinas has to make some sort of account of the fact that by creation ex nihilo, all the material content of the created world, the gun that goes off, is sustained in existence by God. And these are cases in which theologians in the tradition are trying to make sense of how God can be the material but not formal and final cause of sin, but nonetheless he's got to concur with the efficient cause. And you're doing all that wrangling, right? So neither Calvin nor Luther are metaphysicians trained, but guess what? They trained metaphysicians like Melanchthon, and they trained others later in the tradition who do exactly this. So I could throw up quotes where it looks like Suarez is saying God is the author of sin. I don't actually think that Suarez and Bellarmine think that God is the author of sin. The question is when you press down into the metaphysical and conceptual issues, whether or not you're getting an actual substantive difference. So here's another example. Never say double in terms of predestination. Why? So if you're talking about eschatological ends, what is the double, when we speak about double predestination, what is it referred to? Well, if double eschatological ends, if the double refers to heaven and hell, then that refers to literally every Orthodox theologian. Everyone except for D.B. Hart, right? Who's a universalist. So that distinction is trivial. If you're referring to divine intentions, well, God, even on the universalist account, not everyone, like, Hitler's life is not the same as my life, is not the same as Mother Teresa's life, even though they all end up at the same destination. How God interacts with that person, how much sin that God allows that person to, or how much grace that person experiences over the course of their life, that's different. And with respect to evil means or causality, to come back to your authorship of sin question, no one except for the Manichees says that God actively infuses vice into anybody because they have a prior commitment to primitive theories of explanation and causation with respect to sin. I mean, Aquinas, when he's talking about, at least the translator of Aquinas on Romans 9, when he's talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, the translator chose the word occasional cause for God's agency in that space. So, just to push back, I would say, like, I think the framework is not all that dissimilar when you go to the symbolic and the confessional documents, and you compare, which are typically from the early modern period written in more scholastic language, and then you contrast that with, say, like, I think Luther made a mistake to throw out the necessity of the consequence and the necessity of the consequent. He does that in the Bondage of the Will, and then he walks it back later on in his commentaries. So, there are differences.
I think we're going to have to move on to the next speaker. Yes, I think so. So thank you, Dr. Hancock. Next up, we have Dr. Adam Wood. Dr. Wood is a professor and department chair of philosophy at Wheaton College in Illinois. His research has focused mainly on Aquinas' philosophical psychology, along with various topics in philosophy of religion, including the resurrection, predestination, and the problem of hell. He did his PhD work at Fordham, but he's not an ardent Notre Dame football fan. He'll be presenting part of a paper entitled Aquinas on How God Moves Human Wills and the Prospects of a Thomistic Free Will Theodicy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wood. Yes.
Thanks. All right, thank you. I'm not sure I made enough handouts for everybody. I didn't expect there to be so many people here. This is wonderful. I'll launch right in as those are going around. God does not and cannot cause sin, Thomas Aquinas makes clear, but he does permit it. Why does he permit it? Possibly, it is because he wished to create humans, but could not create us, while also preventing us from ever sinning. I will call this line of reasoning the free will theodicy, though for my purposes nothing rides on whether we call it a theodicy or a defense. While he never does so explicitly, there are strong reasons for supposing that Aquinas would have rejected the free will theodicy, based on his understanding of the relationship between divine causality and creaturely freedom. Aquinas thinks God moves our wills to make whatever free choices we make and perform whatever free actions we perform, and he does so efficaciously, meaning his moving our wills to a given state ensures that they will indeed occupy it. That includes, Thomas thinks, causing our acts of sin, albeit not our sins themselves. One might suppose then that God could create humans, then cause them only ever to make virtuous choices, refraining from causing any acts of sin, and thus preventing sin altogether. The fact that Aquinas thinks God confirms some humans in goodness in this life, keeping these humans from ever sinning, might seem to reinforce this assessment. Various of Aquinas' interpreters seem broadly to agree that these considerations amount to a powerful case against a Thomistic free will theodicy. Other interpreters disagree, arguing that Aquinas does indeed embrace a sort of free will theodicy, even if it differs from those of contemporary philosophers of religion like Alvin Plantinga. What none of these interpreters has so far accomplished, in my estimation, is explaining how the things that Thomas says about God moving human wills, confirming us in goodness, and so forth, might allow him to accept a free will theodicy. This is the task I will take up in what follows. In the longer version of this paper, I begin by arguing that in general, and in the abstract, Aquinas does indeed think God can move our wills to occupy whatever state he wishes them to. Furthermore, I argue, God can do this in a way acceptable to robust libertarian interpreters of Aquinas, leaving intact our ability to will otherwise, all antecedent conditions remaining the same. Of course, not everyone reads Aquinas as regarding this sort of leeway for free choices and actions, but I take it that Aquinas' compatibilist interpreters, or less robust libertarian interpreters, will require even less convincing of the basic point I make in this first section of the paper, namely that in general and in the abstract, God can move our wills in whatever direction he pleases while leaving us free. My reading is largely based on recent work by W. Matthews Grant. I'd be happy to discuss it in the Q&A, but I'll skip over it for now, since I credit Matthews with most of the good ideas in it. Instead, what I will present this morning is my proposed explanation how, for Aquinas, even if God can move our wills as I've just described in general and in the abstract, nevertheless, in particular concrete cases, our psychology and circumstances might impose limitations on how he can do so. Indeed, I will argue, these limitations might be such that God cannot create humans while preventing us from ever sinning. And because, as I already noted, Aquinas' views on confirmation in goodness might appear to weigh against my interpretation, I will make my case by focusing in particular on texts where he addresses this issue. Having argued that Aquinas might accept a free will theodicy, given his views on divine causation and human freedom, I will conclude by suggesting at least one reason for thinking that he does accept a free will theodicy, even though he nowhere makes this particularly clear. Okay, if Aquinas thinks God can confirm some of us in goodness, then why couldn't he confirm all of us? To address this question, consider a few important claims Aquinas makes. First, God cannot make any creatures who are by their very nature unable to sin. Doing so, Aquinas thinks, would imply a contradiction. Second, however, God can confirm creatures in goodness in one of two ways: by grace. The first way is by giving them a vision of his essence. Given the ways this vision will satisfy the intellect and will alike, Aquinas thinks having it in view will make sin altogether impossible for any creature enjoying it. In this life, however, we humans are only able to experience the beatific vision through the miraculous process Aquinas calls rapture, and only for short periods of time. But a more lasting way God can confirm us in goodness in this life is by a series of providential interventions similar, he says, to those whereby he preserved Adam and Eve in a state of quasi-immortality before the fall. Part of the grace God bestowed on them at their creation involved their bodies being subject to their souls, such that they would never get sick or die or be troubled by inordinate passions. Their bodies were nevertheless still passible, such that they could be killed by external forces. But God made sure this wouldn't happen by giving them mastery over all other creatures beneath them and by placing them in paradise. Similarly, God can bestow grace on post-fall humans such that they perfectly possess the virtues of wisdom and counsel, and hence never err regarding any of the ends or means involved in decision-making. He can also ensure that their lower powers are kept in check by infused virtues of temperance, courage, and so forth. By these gifts of grace, God can ensure that we will sin only with great difficulty, Aquinas says. Even so, he goes on, it would be impossible for any human other than Christ himself to remain in this life, quote, always in the act of correct contemplation, so that the reason for everything we do is God, unquote, or to remain completely unobstructed by our lower powers. Hence, he continues, everything that is lacking in confirmation in goodness is provided by the watchfulness of God's providence, so that whenever an occasion for sin presents itself, the mind of the one so confirmed is divinely caused to resist. In other words, just as God arranged both the internal constitution of our first parents and their external circumstances to ensure they wouldn't die before they fell, Aquinas, so too he can arrange our constitutions and circumstances by grace and by providence so that we won't sin. Aquinas thinks Mary, the Mother of God, is the person whom God most obviously confirmed in goodness in this second way, such that she never actually sinned at all, but that God also did so for the apostles later in their careers. So why couldn't God confirm all humans in goodness in one of these two ways? The gist of my thought is this. Aquinas maintains that grace perfects nature rather than destroying it. But God seemingly might destroy something's nature by supernaturally assisting it too much or in the wrong ways. And it seems entirely possible that the type and amount of gracious assistance it would have required for God to prevent all of us from ever sinning would have overwhelmed our natures, stripping from us the freedom essential to our humanity. Consider the first route by which Aquinas thinks God can confirm creatures in goodness, the beatific vision route. Could God have created humans and beatified them immediately so that they never had any opportunities to sin? As far as I can tell, Thomas does suggest at one point that God could have beatified all the angels immediately, but things seem more complicated in the human case, given that we are animals. In this life, as I noticed, Aquinas thinks we can see God's essence only when our sense powers are suspended in a state of rapture. Some humans appear, according to their hagiographies, to have spent a great portion of their lives beholding God in just this way. St. Catherine of Siena comes to mind. If God maintained a human like Catherine throughout her entire life in a continuous state of enraptured vision of his essence, such that she never made use of her sense powers at all, then it seems doubtful to me whether she could rightly be said to have lived an animal life. Post-resurrection, it does seem as though Aquinas thinks we'll be able to operate the senses of our glorified bodies while also beholding God's essence. But if God immediately granted us all glorified bodies, it seems equally doubtful whether we could rightly be said ever to live animal lives. It seems as though confirming us in goodness by beatifying us immediately would very likely destroy our animal natures, and thus our human natures. Well, what about the second route by which God can confirm humans in goodness? Clearly, God can assist some humans by grace in this way without destroying their natures as humans. The cases of Mary and the apostles make this clear. What seems to me an open question, however, is whether Aquinas thinks God could have assisted all humans this way. It's notable that Aquinas' discussion of how God confirms Mary and others in goodness doesn't take what might seem like the direct and obvious route, namely stating baldly that God does so simply by refraining from causing in them any acts of sin. Instead, Aquinas attends carefully to the various psychological and environmental factors that might cause someone like Mary to sin, and explains how God, by gracious provision, rules out each of them in turn. What this suggests is that while Aquinas thinks God can move the will as he wishes in the abstract, in concrete cases, he must operate according to the psychology and circumstances of the particular will in question. Just what it takes to prevent us from sinning might vary from individual to individual. It might require more strenuous intervention on his part in some cases than others. In some cases, indeed, it might even require miraculous intervention. Aquinas does seem certain that some acts of will take miraculous activity on God's part. He cites the conversion of Paul as an example, explaining that ordinarily conversions come about only gradually over time after much internal preparation. For Paul, God dispensed with the internal preparation and sped up the process dramatically. Yet even in his case, God didn't simply throw Paul's psychology into reverse without further ado. Rather, Aquinas says it took a miraculous external prostration, a corporeal brightness knocking him down and treading upon him. Now, Thomas doesn't claim explicitly that the sort of gracious assistance it took to confirm Mary and the apostles in goodness required miraculous activity, but it seems not a stretch to suppose that infusing meekness sufficient to keep Peter's hot temper in check throughout the later part of his life might have taken many pretty substantial miracles. Suppose this is correct. In that case, the question is whether God could have performed all the miracles it would have taken to keep all humans from ever sinning. Above, I suggested, plausibly I think, that to maintain a human continuously in a state of rapture throughout her life would overwhelm her nature as an animal. Could it be that for some, perhaps many humans, the extent of the miraculous activity involved in preventing them from sinning would overwhelm their nature as free, rational animals? To me, this seems not just possible, but even likely. If God could confirm any group of humans in goodness throughout their lives, it would surely have been Adam, Eve, and their offspring living in paradise before sin ever entered the world. Yet Aquinas thinks God did quite a lot for our first parents already, such as preventing the devil from tempting Eve in angelic form as he wished to, and forcing him to slither into paradise instead, something he says. Adam and Eve's offspring wouldn't have been born confirmed in goodness, Aquinas tells us. They would have been unequal to one another in virtue and related to one another in terms of mastery and subjecthood. It seems not just possible, but even likely to me that for any such group of humans living in close proximity throughout their lives, no matter how paradisal their surroundings, to prevent them from sinning would require extensive miraculous activity on God's part, so extensive even as to overwhelm their nature as animals with freedom of choice, able to decide between sinning and not sinning. My proposal here is admittedly somewhat speculative, going beyond anything Aquinas says explicitly, but I trust it isn't idly speculative. It is rooted in things Aquinas does tell us about how God can confirm creatures in goodness and the miracles he sometimes requires to move our wills. And as I'll conclude by explaining, there is at least some evidence that it represents Aquinas' actual view, even if he leaves it largely tacit. Okay, concluding, in the longer version of this paper, I examine several strands of evidence, some of them direct, some circumstantial. For now, time will only permit me to consider one of them, coming from the only passage I know of in which Aquinas directly raises the question whether God should have permitted humans to sin or be tempted. In this passage from Aquinas' Sentences commentary, he does indeed appear to link God's permission of sin with his desire to preserve human freedom. I put the full passage on your handout, but the underlined part interests me most. This is where Aquinas writes that, quote, "If sin were impeded entirely, this would take away many grades of goodness, for it would take away that nature which is able to sin and not to sin, which is indeed good. And also the ability to arise out of sin would be taken away, and many things of this sort, which, were they taken away, would detract much from the goodness of the universe. It stands to reason that taking away sin altogether would take away the ability to arise out of sin. I can't repent of my sins and receive forgiveness if I have no sins to forgive. Repentance and forgiveness are very good things, and Christ's atoning sacrifice that makes them possible for us is immeasurably good. One might suppose that this line of the passage expresses a sort of felix culpa theodicy, something that Aquinas does more explicitly elsewhere. But what about the line where he says that impeding sin entirely would take away that nature which is able to sin and not to sin? As I mentioned earlier in the longer version of this paper, I argue that in general and in the abstract, God can cause us to choose or act as he wishes without taking away the possibility of our choosing or acting otherwise. So why does he suggest here that preventing us from sinning would indeed remove this power on our parts? My proposal, again, is that preventing sin altogether turns out to be impossible in the concrete case of creating actual humans. The steps that would have been required to confirm all of us in the good after creating us might have been drastic enough as to overwhelm our nature as free, with the ability to choose between one thing and another. Opponents of my position might suggest alternative interpretations of this passage or dismiss it as an early idiosyncratic text that Aquinas moved on from later in his career. Yet because it addresses God's permission of sin in a uniquely direct way and appears on its face to endorse the free will theodicy, I take it to offer some initial support for my reading. I'd be happy to talk through some of the other strands of evidence I discuss in the longer version of this paper during the Q&A, but I should leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that wasn't last time, so I'll just talk for a second. Yeah, Yeah, thank you very much. I guess I have, I have maybe a suggestion or a thought.
Great.
So the first thing is, I'm a little worried about some of the arguments in the first part of the paper here.
Okay.
For instance, the idea that by intervening miraculously, for instance, in giving everybody the beatific vision, we wouldn't be able to live an animal life, or that the glorified body is not a real animal life. I'd worry about saying things like that. And I'd similarly worry about even the providential intervention as somehow, that would somehow be destructive of human nature. I worry about all those things. I'm not going to give you my arguments against them, but I'm just going to say, I don't think you need to say that.
Okay.
So here's how you might argue differently.
Yeah.
But so I have a strategy in the Hell book about some of this and how we think about it that's quite different. But this is a point that I think is valid. And I think you could make an argument like this. And I think it's the point in the Sentences commentary, which you also find in the Summa contra Gentiles, by the way. I think it's book 3, where he's talking about providence, 3a. Whether God could have prevented all sin comes up in there.
Yeah.
And he gives a similar explanation. Here's what you might want to say. Human beings, because he does give very clearly in the De Veritate the argument that God could not create a rational free person who is by nature impeccable. So you might say something like this. He thinks human beings have essentially contingent decision making. That's like a necessary or essential feature of created persons, that the contingency of their decisions. I tend to think it's libertarian free will, but whatever you want to call it. It seems like there'd be a problem if God would have inconsistent intentions in creating something that has contingent, it's intrinsically contingent, and then thwarting it, people in contemporary philosophy called finking it, finking those dispositions so that they never manifest, right? So it'd be sort of a occasionalism, the same thing with occasionalism, right? If God made things to fall down through gravity, but always miraculously intervened to make them go up, why'd he do it in the first place? You might think there's like an inconsistency in God's intentions, something like that. So it's not to say that God can't make things go up. God could, right? Miracles are possible within the order, but a whole order that's run only by miracles would seem contradictory to God's intentions in creating natures in the first place. Yeah. So that's a different way of making the argument that doesn't require you to say the other stuff, but you get the point anyway, right? And you can find the things he says about miracles and the arguments about why he shouldn't run everything by miracles, and that's the same point.
Yeah. Thanks for the suggestion. I'd love to follow up on that later. I think my worry, that sort of line makes sense to me perfectly well in the case of the natural world and natural evils, right? If God set up miracle world where, naturally speaking, lions eat gazelles and that kills the gazelles and so forth, but God always intervened to make sure that gazelles never died, you would clearly be, just wiping out the nature of the thing in question. But given that Aquinas does think God can confirm some humans in goodness in this life, it seems to me that the cases aren't exactly parallel there. So what I was wondering in this paper is, do we need something more in terms of explanation why God doesn't avail himself of that option?
Let me just say, I was pointing out that confirming them in goodness is a miracle. That's the argument.
Yeah.
Thing. So if God did that for everyone, it would
Right.
miracles all around.
Yeah.
That's sort of the
Great. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I think there is something like a traditional Thomistic line of reasoning here that you're kind of alluding to, that modern Thomists have also expressed, not quite in the way you do, but in a at least similar way. So we have this idea that God governs things in accordance with their natures, in a way that is adapted to the way they are, essentially, so to speak. And then people like Serge Thomas Bonino, he says that this is the reason why God allowed Adam and Eve to sin, because as Father Rooney pointed out, God cannot create a free creature who is by nature impeccable. And the fact that there is a possibility that the human nature is such that by nature there is a possibility, it's possible to sin, then it's appropriate or it's fitting for God to allow that potential, that possibility to sometimes be actualized. That's the line of reasoning of Bonino. And you find the same line of reasoning, Stephen Long has some formulations about this. Patrick Taylor O'Neill too refers to this line of reasoning. So what I would suggest, and here I'm connecting a bit to what Father Rooney said, maybe you could present a slightly, not as strong an argument as you're presenting now, but more like a fittingness argument, ex convenientia, that it's not absolutely impossible for God to act in this miraculous way, but it would be it would be very unfitting. It would create some kind of contradiction between the natures that God creates and the way he governs these natures if he were to exclude all sin, so to speak. I don't know if that would, of course, that would make it less efficient as a theodicy, because then people could say that, well, evil is so terrible, so even if it's not fitting for God to govern humans in a way that makes them not sin, God should do it anyway. But I think you can, from a Thomistic perspective, you can argue that it's actually reasonable for God to govern things in accordance with the natures, even though there are evil consequences, as long as there is a greater good somewhere that outweighs these evil consequences.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And then the question is, what is that greater good? And in some discussions, Aquinas points to things like the ability to arise out of sin. He has kind of a felix culpa line of reasoning. In other passages, like in the Romans commentary, for example, he's pointing mainly to God's ability to manifest his justice and mercy and so forth. So I think he has various different ideas about what the greater good might be, but none of those, I think, are properly speaking a free will theodicy. So
But you could maybe portray one aspect of the greater good would be this fittingness aspect, that it's a world in which God governs things in accordance with the natures that doesn't contradict the natures.
Sure.
Is better than a world where
Yeah.
If the purpose of God's creation is to manifest God's goodness outside of God, then it's very important from this perspective that there is no contradiction between the natures of things and the providential rule of God, all of those things. So maybe that could be an argument.
Thank you for that suggestion. I'll have to think that over more.
I think it's time to move on to our final speaker. Thank you, Dr. Wood. Finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Montague Brown. Professor Montague Brown is a professor of philosophy at St. Anselm College, director of the Institute of St. Anselm Studies, and editor of the St. Anselm Journal. His areas of interest are medieval philosophy, mainly Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, metaphysics, ethics, and the relation between faith and reason. His most recent books are Freedom, Philosophy, and Faith, The Transformative Role of Judeo-Christian Freedom in Western Thought, and Reason, Revelation, and Metaphysics, The Transcendental Analogies. The title of his paper is Freedom as a Moral and Metaphysical Principle. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, my paper is about ethics and metaphysics, but the moral question is there throughout the paper. So I'll be spending actually most of the quantitative time on the metaphysical notion of freedom. Anyway, freedom is a first principle of ethics and metaphysics. However, in both cases, its primacy is ambiguous. Freedom is a self-evident principle of ethics and therefore has no prior cause of its intelligibility. Without it, no one chooses, and so no one can coherently be praised or blamed, for no one can be responsible for what One can only be responsible for what one chooses. However, the moral primacy of freedom is ambiguous in that, unlike the self-evident human goods, such as life, knowledge, friendship, freedom is not a moral principle as to content. Basic goods are to be promoted and not violated, but promoting the freedom of an action is only good if the act is good. Evil acts are morally worse if freely done. Thus, the role of freedom in ethics is negative. That is, there can be no moral life without freedom, free choice. As to metaphysics, freedom seems at first irrelevant. Theoretical reason, whether empirical science, mathematics, or metaphysics, seeks the truth, with certainty as the ideal. But certainty is forthcoming most conspicuously when one's conclusions are necessary. Metaphysics proposes its conclusions as certain, either as necessary deductions from that which is already known, or as necessary implications of our experience of the world. However, a complete metaphysics must be about everything, and this includes human beings with their free choices. Only if the first metaphysical principle is free is there reason to believe that any of its effects is free. A complete and coherent metaphysics must be an account of the freedom of reality. Thus, freedom is a positive metaphysical principle, though it is not self-evident. It is the conclusion of a systematic realist metaphysics. In this paper, we shall lay out these ambiguities in holding freedom as a first principle of ethics and metaphysics in conversation with Thomas Aquinas. So the first part was fairly brief on as a moral principle. Since freedom is a self-evident principle of practical reason, there are no proofs for it except those that point to the absurdity of denying it. Freedom is a first principle of the moral life. Without freedom, all human activity would be meaningless, including any act aimed at refuting or affirming this or any other argument. The only arguments that can be made for any first principle are reductio ad absurdum arguments. By definition, no deductive proof for a first principle is possible, for then the principle would not be first. Thus, Thomas, following Augustine, says, man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. So although freedom of choice is not something logically, physically, or metaphysically provable, when we turn to the business of understanding all of reality and our place in it, i.e. when we are intent on a systematic metaphysics, freedom of choice surprisingly claims its place as a first principle, without which reality is either necessitated or random. In either case, without intelligibility, since it knows no place for human agency. This claim of the metaphysical primacy of freedom, however, is not ultimately a conclusion of natural or philosophical theology, but is only underwritten by revelation. Although philosophical metaphysics leaves open the possibility of freedom, freedom cannot be proven by philosophical metaphysics to be real. It is neither empirically verifiable nor a necessary conclusion of reason from prior information. Thus, for the God of philosophy, whose existence is proven from our experience of the world and what the experience leaves unanswered, one can propose a negative confirmation of freedom in God as the first principle. God is not coerced. As a first principle, God has nothing metaphysically prior causing him to act. However, it could be that God's nature necessitates God to act in a certain way. This is compatible with the view of Plato's good, Aristotle's self-thinking thought, Plotinus' one, and so with Thomas's 5 ways, which are all found in one form or another in Plato or Aristotle. However, there are problems with this understanding of God and how God relates to creation. My knowledge of my freedom is absolutely certain. There can be no conscience or consciousness without it. I know that I am free. Thus, the first principle of reality must be free, for one cannot get something from nothing. This insight into the self-evident philosophical ground for insisting on a free first principle, one that can satisfy the condition of the possibility for human freedom and so of human responsibility. This insight is the foundation grow. The answer cannot be just negative, that nothing coerces the first principle. The freedom of the first principle, though transcendent and therefore mysterious, must be intelligible to me as a moral freedom involving an intentional act. This requires that there be some intelligible, real relation between God and me, some workable analogy between God's freedom and mine. But according to Aquinas, in terms of natural theology, there is no real relation between God and me. And so the analogy fails to provide me any insight to the mystery of human freedom in the face of divine causality. When speaking about how we name God, Aquinas makes the distinction between names that clearly come from our experience of the world and those that ultimately do not. In addition to names that indicate that what God is not, negative theology, and those that refer to him as cause, which is really to insist on that all things are effects, there are terms that apply positively and substantially to God. Such terms apply to God and creatures neither univocally nor equivocally, but analogically. Depending on the terms, they apply primarily to creatures and secondarily to God, or vice versa. For example, if we say that God is a rock or a light, the primary analogate for this analogical application of terms is the created reality, the nature of rock or light. However, if we are using terms such as being, truth, goodness, and beauty, the so-called transcendentals, the prime analogate for the analogical usage of the term is God, since all things come from God. Aquinas says that the intelligibility of the prime analogate enters into the definition of the secondary analogates. He gives Aristotle's example of how healthy is analogically applied to things. We call animal, medicine, and urine healthy according to a prime meaning, which is the healthy animal. Only if we know what it is to be a healthy animal can we know what healthy medicine or urine is. Since we do not know by natural theology what God is, we do not know the primary meaning of being, truth, goodness, and beauty, nor consequently the meaning of these terms as they apply to creatures. That is, the meaning that enters into their definitions. Where does freedom fit into this discussion of analogy in the transcendentals? Since the fullness of freedom, as the fullness of the other transcendentals, exists only in God, God must be the prime analogate of freedom. Father Donald Keefe proposes that freedom is a transcendental, analogically applicable to all things, creatures, and even the Creator. It is this context that freedom is an analogical term, entering into the definition of every creature, but centered on what freedom is in God. However, philosophically, we do not know what God is or what freedom in God could be. The conclusion of the philosophical arguments from our experience of the world that cannot explain itself without remainder is the existence of a transcendent cause, which is not really related to the things that prompt that conclusion. Were it really related, it would share a common context with those things, and so would not be the ultimate cause, since every common effect requires a common cause. Since, as Thomas says, we know by these arguments that God exists but not what God is, the divine prime analogate fails to offer anything in the way of intelligibility to the reality we experience. Thomas, of course, knows by faith and believes that God enters into real relation with the world, and in particular with human beings. This is clear in the doctrines of the free creation, the incarnation, and our salvation in Christ. And he tries to make room in his philosophical method for this possibility. But if fueled only by arguments derived from Greek philosophy, the attempt must fail. Characteristic of what we mean by God is that this being, that is from natural theology, is infinite and omnipotent. That this being gives up some of its power to share freely with creatures, i.e., that there's real secondary causality, a covenantal union with God, is not part of the meaning of infinite omnipotence. Thomas says that God can do anything that is not a contradiction. This would include being the cause, even the only cause, of the actions of creatures. Not what Aquinas says, but it seems to me it could be that way. Since philosophical metaphysics cannot refute the possibility of God does everything, that there is no real secondary causality, we must turn elsewhere if we would affirm a real relation between the human and the divine. In short, if there is to be an analogy of freedom, as there is for the other transcendentals, then it cannot be based on the notion of God's freedom provided by natural reason, since we have no notion of such a freedom. However, through revelation, we do know that God is what God is. God is a trinity of persons, each freely giving all that each is and has to the other two. Ultimately, we know that there is a real relation between the divine and the human because Jesus tells us. There is indeed an order. The Father sends the Son to give the Spirit, but the authority of the Father is there only for the good of the Son and the Spirit. This truth underlies the truth of the free creation, which is a real relation between Christ and the world. The whole Christ, which Augustine particularly talks about, but so does Aquinas, is Jesus and those for whom Jesus died, which is everyone. Jesus is the head, the source of the church, and like the Father's headship in the Trinity, his authority is wielded not for the sake of power over creation, but for the good of those under authority. The action of God, who is intrinsic personal freedom, is free. And Revelation points out that the act of creation is intentional, and that from the beginning, quote from Ephesians, God chose us in Christ before the world began, it's a prerequisite for the existence of moral freedom. If there is any question about the moral freedom of the first principle, then there is a question about the moral freedom of all things created by that first principle. As there is no question of personal freedom in the doctrinal definition of God, so there is no question of our moral freedom and the analogical freedom of all other things. This is underlined by the covenantal freedom of Christ, who is freely one with the church in the free creation. Not only does Thomas recognize the difficulties in accounting for genuine freedom based on pagan philosophy, he also provides the principle of a solution. It is commonplace to say that as Augustine baptizes Plato, so Thomas baptizes Aristotle. There's a good deal of truth in this. However, it's not just that his introduction of esse as the ultimate actuality of things and the indication of a free creation, it's not just that it adds another level of potency and act to Aristotle's matter, form, substance, accident, foundation of reality. Thomas's emphasis on esse insists that the act of being is an event, not a structure, the event underlying all reality, the free creation. There are real problems in making the revealed truths of faith fit into an Aristotelian scheme. In the first place, essence or structure dominates Aristotle's metaphysics. Although not as abstract as Plato's world of forms, Aristotle's world of things is unchanging in its substantial structure. Thomas's esse does not fit under form, as if it had a substantial intelligibility. Rather, it is the form of forms, the act of act. However, Thomas is not always free from the essentialism of Aristotle. When applying Aristotelian principles to the question of nature and grace, Thomas considers grace to be an accident. This brings with it a couple of major problems. It places nature at the as a precondition for grace, which puts into question the free creation. As Father Keefe puts it, it is to assume grace to be within the potency of nature, as though freedom could be discovered as implicit within the necessary structures of natural substances. Close quote. And it presents grace as something that may or may not be given, presenting the specter of salvation that has nothing to do with personal assent, but is in God's hands merely. According to Father Keefe, Thomas's esse is the key to understanding the world as freely created, as a world of historical meaning, giving to the individual intrinsic intelligibility, not just what is provided by formal characteristics. In short, giving historical freedom to the world and especially to human beings. Creation must be more than a necessary cosmological first principle. It must account for the free newness of the world, and especially for every responsible human act. It must account for each person's active and free historical search for the true and the good. In other words, the esse essentia distinction is really a theological distinction, Father Keefe will argue. The attempt to make it work according to some natural theology or philosophical metaphysics is doomed to failure, for there is no real relation between the cosmological Deus unus and creatures. Without such a relation established, there is no metaphysical ground for the freedom of human beings. The radical difference between the infinite omnipotence of the deity and the finite dependence of other things makes it hard for us to account for the certainty of secondary causality. Keefe sees Thomism, this is his praise of it, with its distinction of esse and essentia as, quote, the one significant metaphysics with theological application. On the failure of Thomas to make use of this essential distinction, this historical notion of creation, which makes possible the understanding of creation as historical and therefore free, Keefe notes that, quote, the loss for Catholic theology is beyond calculation. Thomas, in his later work, moves in this direction, that is, in the direction of recognizing grace implied by the principle of esse as the ground of freedom, a substantial, not accidental. It seems that Thomas changed his mind on this due to his stay in Rome, which has been mentioned a little bit, work in the library, when he learned of the Second Council of Orange, which condemned semi-Pelagianism and expressed the truth that grace precedes free will. Only if communion with God is universally offered as a grace that is substantial, not accidental, could impiety of the believer be a sin, which Thomas says it is. As Thomas puts it, to have faith is not part of human nature, but it is part of human nature that man's mind should not thwart this inner instinct and the outward preaching of the truth. Hence, in this way, unbelief is contrary to nature. Thomas mentions the other impulse, this inner impulse or instinct in a number of places, and he also follows Augustine in talking about the trahi ad Deo, being drawn to God, which comes from the commentary on the Gospel of John. Every human being, as created in Christ, is freely drawn to the Father. There is no coercion, as Augustine says. No one can believe unless he is willing. This is also affirmed by Thomas. This grace is substantial, present to everyone as created in Christ, and only an obstacle in the heart of those who refuse it keeps it from being received. In conclusion, one's freedom is self-evident. It cannot even be put in question except by a free historical act of the mind and will. This is certain. The systematic metaphysical issue is to provide for the possibility of such intrinsic freedom in the world. What are the intrinsic conditions for the possibility of one's freedom? The answer must be that it is present from the moment of creation, from the beginning, which as Augustine would say, the beginning is Christ. If the advent of human freedom is added along the way, we must ask what that would mean. Is it imposed from without? If so, how does one avoid the conclusion that the freedom has a necessary cause, in which case it is not free? If it is a random occurrence, how does one account for the unintelligibility of mere chance, making all free responsible choices impossible? Neither necessity nor chance bespeaks moral freedom and attendant responsibility. Nor is it imposed in the beginning. It is not imposed at all. If God makes us free apart from our free assent, there is no freedom. Personal relations are free on both sides, or they do not exist. Such a real mutual relations cannot be explained by pure unity, by the Deus Monus, who is not really related to the world. Only if there is a free relationship as foundational, as principle, can it be found elsewhere. But it is found elsewhere, in every human being. God as Trinity is the foundational relationship. It is shared beyond the Trinity in the created covenantal relationship between Christ and his body, the church, all those for whom he died, which is all human beings. The gift of freedom is found in the beginning. It is historical, or it is as is every free human act. Freedom does not and cannot be caused by any extrinsic cause at all. Only historical metaphysics has a place for genuine, responsible human choices. Thomas provides the key to such a metaphysics in his principle of esse, which cannot be other than the free act, the grace of God in covenantal relation with all creation. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really interesting. So I was wondering, so you said that for Aquinas, the freedom of creation is a revealed truth and not something philosophically demonstrable.
I think that's the way it would work within his system, I think.
Yeah, so I was wondering why not say, so I don't know what Aquinas says about it, but what the early scholastics, for instance, said about it, someone like Roland of Cremona or William of Auvergne, was that you can actually demonstrate the freedom of creation from the principle that a necessary cause always produces the same effect. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the diversity of creation, then it would follow that God must have created freely and not necessarily. So what would Aquinas do with that kind of argument?
Weren't you saying that that necessarily creates an effect? And
well, the same, so the diversity of creation couldn't be explained if creation was necessary.
Yeah, because Aquinas will say, right, that the diversity of things was intentional on God's part.
Right.
But if, so I think Aquinas has in his mind a free creation, but I think the arguments from natural theology aren't going to give him that, since we can come to the notion that there is a first principle, but that principle, Aquinas says in many places, not really related to creation. And so if you're going to have a covenantal relation, it can't be based on that philosophical basis alone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to ask something similar, but I kind of going back to the last two papers, I've kind of had in mind the question about free will that, so I guess here's the way of asking it. Are there human beings who cannot, it's of necessity that they can't accept the offer of grace, as distinct from there being humans who contingently, though offered the grace, choose to not accept it? And if we answer the latter, that everyone could accept grace if they choose to do so, how do we explain them then not choosing to accept the grace? Is that itself something that comes from natural dispositions they have, or things that they didn't choose? And so forth?
Well, again, I think one of the problems with trying to explain freedom of choice, which is what we're talking about here, accepting the grace or not, is that we try to give arguments from theoretical reason, which, okay, Aquinas, after he says it's based on the fact that otherwise the rewards and punishment would be in vain, which I think is the main reductio argument, he does say, well, it's also because we're rational, and because we're rational we have freedom. But I think the self-evidence of freedom is something deeper than that. And so I think it would have to be the case, I mean, if someone is very defective mentally, then that person does not recognize the possibility of the choice. But I think for every human being, we can. And it's a mysterious thing. The point, I think, goes back a little bit to Augustine in the Confessions and the Pairs. And Augustine, unlike Plato and Aristotle, there is no positive explanation for sin. Sin is just, I choose it. You know, did I do it for the good of beauty of the food, or because I was hungry, or because of friendship? No, I did it because it was bad. So it seems like the possibility human beings can just reject grace. And so if it's offered, and so in terms of the fall and all that, I don't want to get, and that's a very complicated situation, but what Keith is going to say is the fall, there has to be an offer of grace prior to the fall, and that's rejected. Freely rejected, not rejected because of some necessary reason or disposition, but freedom. And that also, the good news is that makes possible the real free relation we can have with Christ and with God the Trinity.
Hi, thank you. I found that's kind of trendy to deny free will. When you say that
I'm not denying freedom. I'm
No,
insisting
I know,
on it. Okay,
not
sorry.
you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
When you say that freedom is a first principle,
Yeah.
does that basically render all the discussions about whether or not we have free will, are those discussions basically in vain, or
Yeah, well, in a way, and so I think you have to be careful when you get into theodicy. As Augustine gets into trouble sometimes, he says, well, you know, because free will is a good thing because we have intellectual creatures. Well, that's a metaphysical perfection taking the place of a moral imperfection. So yes, it can be acceptable because, I mean, it's nice to have all kinds of creatures in the world, but it can never be a good to intentionally sin. It can never be good to intentionally reject good. So I think that's a kind of a fundamental principle.
So I guess, what do you say to somebody who comes up, who denies free will? Do you say, this is just the way I see it?
I say like what Augustine says on free choice of the will. Do you have a will? He doesn't know. Do you want to know? I don't know what that is. Then don't ask me any questions. Because we can't have a conversation unless we are freely engaged in each other. So see, it's that kind of a first principle. It doesn't make, it's not a principle of like, well, you know, now that at least I murdered somebody freely. That makes it, you know, my choice, my passion. Of course not. But you can't have a moral life or a conscience or a community without freedom.
We have time for one more question.
I was just curious about the claim you suggested that freedom is a transcendental property.
Right, yeah.
I wasn't sure I quite understood how that would work. Like I think I understand the sense in which like a rock
Yeah.
is good and is one
Yeah,
and is
yeah,
beautiful,
yeah.
but not in the sense in which it is free.
Right. Well, if free creation, obviously the most telling freedom we know about in creation is my freedom. I can't deny it. But there's certain freedom of animals, particularly higher animals, my students try to point out. I mean, it doesn't measure up to us, but it's analogically there. You can say plants seek something like that sort. And even physics studies a world that physics doesn't design. I mean, you know, we have your hypotheses, but then you have to respond to what's freely coming. It's a free creation. It's not a dead creation. And so I think analogically, obviously the freedom of an electron is something way down the line from anything that we recognize as being moral freedom, but that's, I think, what I'd say there.
Let's thank all of our speakers one more time.
Thank you. And I think, you know, what goes with both of your papers, I mean, what this does is take very seriously Scripture. What, you know, all things are created in Christ. Well, what does that mean? And the fall of creation and all that stuff.